Vitals banks. Andrew Jackson did not like the Bank of the United States that Hamilton had created because he felt that it had too big of an influence on national affairs. Um, so instead, he wanted to come up with a bank that would better represent the will of the working and rural class people. Henry Clay wanted the bank to be a political issue for the upcoming presidential election in 1832 against Jackson. And so there's this dude named Nicholas Beidel, who is the chairman of this bank, who worked with Clay to recharter the bank for 4 years earlier than it was due. Jackson vetoed the measure, increasing his popularity. So he kind of overturned Hamilton. Texas leading up to the Battle of the Alamo, Mexico refused to sell Texas to the United States, which had given up its claims to Texas in the Adams-Oneida Treaty. Texas has been a state in the Republic of Mexico since 1822, following a revolution against Spain. Mexico offered huge land grants for immigration to the area, kind of as a bribe to entice people to move there, and many Americans responded and came to Texas, increasing population and revenue in Texas. Southerners moved to Mexico with interest in becoming slave masters, but the presence of slavery angered the Mexican government. At this point in time, most countries in the world had actually outlawed slavery. America. Southerners moved to Mexico. In addition to religious minorities, also are going to move to Mexico. When the population changed, Mexico's power began to erode, and so Stephen Austin worked to make Texas a Mexican state, and then later he made it independent of Mexico. During this revolution against Mexico, Fort Alamo was attacked by the Mexican army, and 187 members of the Texas garrison were killed. The head of this, the Mexican military, was a man by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and he was victorious. And so the garrison, the Texas garrison, kind of adopted the cry of "Remember the Alamo" in his future fight for independence. Sam Houston is going to be the leader of the Texas independence movement. He's going to be the one to ultimately, eventually, defeat Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. And he's going to claim independence for the Texas Republic. Houston asked both Jackson and then the next president, Van Buren, to recognize Texas as a state, which they denied out of fear that a new state would be formed, slave state would be formed, which would off the balance again, that had carefully been crafted by the Missouri Compromise. A gag rule forbade discussion of the slavery question in the House of Representatives. Basically, they're like, you know what, we can't ever come up to a solution, so let's just not talk about it. It was kind of like brushing it under the rug. It stemmed from Southern members' fear of slave emancipation, and it led to an increased discussion by Southern conventions of ways to escape Northern economic and political hegemony, which means like superiority. The Picnic of 1837 in Specie Circular. There was a huge recession that was caused by Jackson's drastic moves of federal bank deposits, like moving them to state and local banks and cutting the federal reserves, which led to relaxed credit policies and inflation. Jackson demanded the Specie Circular, which required that land be paid for in hard money and not paper or credit. And then it's ultimately going to be a result that recession that lasts well into the 1840s. The Charles River Bridge case demonstrated that a contract could be broken to benefit the general welfare. Basically, what happened here was that Jackson's Chief Justice, Roger Taney, held that a state could cancel grant money if the grant ceased to be in the interests of the community. Basically, this is going to reverse those earlier Supreme Court cases that said, like, a contract is the most binding document, etc., etc. In particular, it overturned Dartmouth College v. Woodward. The Trail of Tears was the forced removal of Native Americans from Florida to Oklahoma. Worcester v. Georgia was a response to Jackson's Indian Removal Act. The Cherokees in Georgia claimed to be a sovereign political entity. The Native Americans were supported by the Supreme Court, but Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the court's decision. By this point, Cherokees had largely met the government's demands to assimilate into Western-style democratic institutions, but they were forced to give up their lands in the east of Mississippi and Florida and travel to an area in present-day Oklahoma, and along the way, around 4,000 Cherokee died. The Whig Party was a group that is going to form from the old Federalist Party, the old National Republican Party, and others who opposed Jackson's policies. Basically, it was the group that responded against the Jacksonian Democrats. It cultivated commercial and industrial development. Sorry about that. It cultivated commercial and industrial development, encouraged banks and corporations, and received support largely from northern businesses and manufacturing interests, as well as from large southern planters. Supporters of the Whig Party included Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a transcendentalist essayist and lecturer. He was most known for his essay called Self-Reliance, which promoted the virtue of independence. He's going to support the idea of like breaking away from society and really getting to learn who you are. Through the themes in his writing and through the independent lifestyle he lived, he strongly influenced American thought and culture. Abolitionism was the idea of freeing the slaves. It started with the idea of purchasing and transporting the slaves to free African states. Very few people supported this theory because of the expense. Anti-slave societies founded some of these states. Monrovia in Liberia, for example, was one of the states that was originally created in Africa to house the returned slaves. But when that failed, you have a lot of these anti-slavery societies who are going to push just to end the institution of slavery across the United States. Some of them faced violent opposition. Eventually, the movement is going to split into two: the radical followers and those who are going to be more active in terms of like lobbying Congress and trying to get laws passed. It entered politics through the Liberty Party, calling for non-expansion of slavery into the new Western territories, and this would eventually combine with the larger Free Soil Party. Horace Mann was an American educator who was the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. He suggested reforms in education and made available high-quality, no-cost, non-denominational public schooling. Basically, he's the father of modern-day public schools. The system has lasted to the present day, and as a result, he's been called the father of the American public school. Hey, that's exactly what I just said. William Lloyd Garrison. He is an abolitionist, and he ran a newspaper called The Liberator. And in it, he is going to talk about his ideas that slaves should be freed. Many other anti-slavery advocates of the 1830s and 1840s recommended a gradualist approach. They wanted to slowly get rid of the institution so that it would be more palatable to the masses. Because of his inflexible position and the fiery language he used in his paper, however, opposition to his policy developed within abolitionist groups. He advocated an unpopular position in favor of equal rights for women as well. And after the Civil War, he promoted free trade, suffrage for women, and fair treatment of Native Americans. Fred Doug, represent. He was an escaped slave and outspoken abolitionist, and he's going to run his own newspaper called the North Star. In it, he's going to talk about his experiences in slavery, as well as obviously promoting abolitionism. He favored the use of political methods for reform. In the Civil War, he helped put together regiments of African Americans from Massachusetts and urged others to join the Union Army. He's known as the father of the American Civil Rights Movement. During the early 1800s, the country experienced massive population change and growth. Because there was a labor shortage, we were going through our industrial revolution, our transportation revolution, so we didn't have enough workers to fill all the new positions. So there was a great opportunity for work, and as such, we saw a huge influx of immigration, particularly from Germany and Ireland. Irish Catholics did face discrimination because of their religion. However, particularly once they had the Irish potato famine, they're going to come over in droves. There was also a growing population in the West. And in the West, the growing population was largely Chinese, actually. And they're going to be the ones to help build a lot of the railroads. Urbanization outgrew public services, leading to inadequate security as well as inadequate clean water for city dwellers, however. Also, you have a lot of riots between different races and religions, and as a result, you had a lot of street crime, and that just kind of became a part of everyday city life. In the early 1800s, women also are going to experience some changes. They are going to be allowed to participate in limited political activity that was mostly religious and reform in nature, such as abolition. They were also limited in terms of their jobs that they were allowed to have, mostly in terms of education. They still lived in what was called the cult of domesticity. Basically, the idea was that it was a woman's role to get married, then take care of the kids, and stay at home and cook for the husband. And the husband's job was to go and work. The women's property became her husband's, and in future years, the women's rights movement would rise to confront this cult of domesticity, although it'd be another 100+ years before really major strides were taken. Martin Van Buren becomes the 8th president. He was a Democrat from New York who had served as Jackson's vice president after Calhoun had left the position. He is known for establishing an independent treasury as well as a system of maintaining government funds independently of the national banking systems. And this is going to be used until 1921. Panic of 1837 hampered attempts to follow Jackson's politics, and he was unsuccessful in re-election. He just really wasn't very popular. William Henry Harrison was immensely popular, nicknamed Old Tippecanoe for his battle victory there. So it was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler is his vice president. William Henry Harrison, however, despite his popularity, didn't do much as president because he died after 31 days, giving the longest inauguration address in history. It was like 2.5 hours in the freezing drizzle because at the time presidents got inaugurated in March. And so he catches pneumonia and he dies. So he's going to be replaced by Tyler, who is the 10th president. He was the state's writer, Southerner, and strict constructionist. He rejected the programs of the Whigs who had elected Harrison, which led them to turn against him. He is going to settle the Webster-Ashburn Treaty between the U.S. and Britain, and he also is going to help Texas achieve statehood in 1845. So speaking of that Webster-Ashburn Treaty, American ships were burned down by Canadian loyalists, and Canada and the U.S. disputed the boundary of Maine. So British ships sometimes stopped American ships to suppress American slave smuggling. So what this treaty does is it basically settles the boundary of Maine, and it also settles some of the other border disputes that Canada and the U.S. were experiencing in terms of the Great Lakes. It's also going to create more cooperation between the U.S. and Britain in curbing the slave trade. So as I said, in terms of the population shift, the 1840s saw a dramatic increase in Irish immigration due to the potato famine in Ireland. The poverty of the Irish immigrants led to settlement in eastern cities and competition for jobs. The 1850s had increases in German immigration because of the failed revolution in Germany in 1848. Many Germans settled in Wisconsin because they had money and other resources which helped to cultivate the upper Midwest portion of the U.S. The Five Points neighborhood of New York City included Irish immigrants, African Americans, and Anglo, Italian, and Jewish cultures. And this is pretty much where you see what we called the melting pot of American cultures, where they all kind of came together, but not really peacefully, and there was a lot of violence, and the movie Gangs in New York is all about it. It's a really good movie, but it's rated R, so, it's up to you. Manifest Destiny is the belief that America was supposed to rule coast to coast, basically. And not just America, but white America. John O'Sullivan, an American journalist, wrote an article pushing for the annexation of Texas, and in that is where he came up with the phrase Manifest Destiny. It was like our God-given right to rule coast to coast. It came out of post-War of 1812 nationalism, the reform impulse of the 1830s, and the need for new resources. Those Whigs who supported Manifest Destiny favored more peaceful means, while other Whigs feared American expansion because it might raise the slavery issue in new territories. If you go into new territories, you eventually become states. Are they going to be slave states or free states? That was obviously going to be an issue for debate, and they were sick of those debates. It was an engine for both discovery and destruction. While it helped America push westward, the ideas behind Manifest Destiny fueled the Mexican War, the displacement of Native Americans, and also future wars. Since we're moving west, we have to have a transportation revolution in the 1840s and 1850s. We had a tremendous expansion of railroad lines, which is going to create a national market for goods. Railroads such as the Baltimore and Ohio, just think of the B&O, that's the B&O from Monopoly. Were developed to help link the Midwest to the East Coast. Steamboats and clipper ships became more popular for travel as well. So really, you saw four economic classes emerge in the South. You had planters, who were the ones who owned the large farms and had large plantations. They were the ones who had the political control and economic control. The yeomen were the largest group. These were mostly, obviously, whites who worked land independently, sometimes along with slaves, to produce their own food, like corn. You had poor whites who lived in squalor, and they were often treated as badly as slaves. However, they had obviously some freedom, whereas slaves did not. 3/4 of whites in the South did not own slaves because most belonged to yeoman groups. Lastly, in terms of slave labor roles, on large farms, white overseers directed African Americans drivers who supervised groups in the fields so they performed gang labor. On smaller farms, the slave was assigned specific tasks and then given the remainder of the day to himself. House servants were spared physical labor, but they enjoyed less privacy and had direct responsibility to the master. So there were different jobs done by different slaves on the plantations.